Welcome to our Race and Equity Working Group. Well, as you heard us, for those of you who are joined us early, 6 more days. America's mandate on race, equity, and an economic system that works for all. And then the real work begins to repair, restore, and rejuvenate our democracy. And it starts with policy, which means it starts with you. So 4.5 months ago, many of you may remember, the movement for Business Confronts Racism began here with American Sustainable Business Council, with more than 400 supporters who participated in a town hall that we held on June 9th that was in response to the murder of George Floyd. ASBC's Race and Equity Working Group was created to address the inequities prevalent and pervasive in the economic and social construct of the United States, and to hold our legislators accountable to social and economic justice. We ensure that the dignity and respect of diverse perspectives, voices, and values of a multicultural America are heard and reflected in our policy work toward creating an equitable and compassionate economy for all. We collaborate with ASBC's policy team to gather support on issues that have a disparate impact on minority communities and minority-owned businesses, on issues such as access to capital, income inequality, criminal justice reform, economic development opportunities, and an economy that works for all. Recent events have provided us with a mandate to advance policies that address systemic racism. And ASBC is uniquely positioned to lead this kind of strategic policy work and engagement on race and equity issues with and on behalf of the business community, because we have a history in this fight for business equity with our work on such policies as Ban the Box. And some of you that are listening might have worked with us on that Ban the Box eliminates the question on a job application that asks about an applicant's criminal history. We work on a fair minimum wage, support of worker ownership, and upgrading our declining infrastructure, which has a devastating impact on our essential water systems, just to list a few. But we have much more work to do. And with your help, we can transform the current approach to key issues with thought leadership in the public square and advocacy campaigns to advance the policies and values we support with focus on tangible wins. Through this initiative to confront racism, we work to define policy where there is none, and back those initiatives and policies that eliminate discriminatory practices and help improve the economic health and well-being of traditionally marginalized sectors of society. And we've identified a number of key issue areas where we have deepened our work. The first being the election. We're presently working with partners like the Equity Alliance, which is based in the Southeast region of the country. Some of you may have listened to our session a couple of weeks ago with Tequila Johnson, who is a co-founder of the Equity Alliance, doing amazing work. And we created a report of her presentation, which is available at our website. I strongly encourage you to view it. We're also working with Together We Vote to increase voter turnout among 18 to 35-year-old Black, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voters through the only multiracial, multicultural, national Get Out the Vote campaign of this scale. Another key issue is area is policing and federal policies. And at present, we're leading several campaigns on specific federal policies, including the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the Ending Qualified Immunity Bill, HR 7085, and the Save Our Streets Act. With regard to impact investing, we are working with several organizations and investment firms, including Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, Trillium Asset Management, Green Retirement, Investor Advocates for Social Justice, to identify strategies and guidelines for investors to address racism, as well as to engage investors in advocacy using their shareholder power. Then there's race equity in the food system. We are convening Black and Latinx food business owners, Black farmers, farm workers, Native leaders, regenerative agriculture leaders, and big business across sectors to address racism in the food system and develop a collaborative public policy agenda, as well as guidelines for internal company policies. Community economic development is our subject today, and we have partnered with the American Independent Business Alliance to provide resources and tools for community leaders to address the issues, as well as to tie these new forms of economic development to support BIPOC enterprises. We are also working with Designing the We that focuses on undesigning the red line. This partnership allows us to develop strategies and tools for undoing structural inequities by offering strategic design and consulting for culture change to systems change, and building and engaging community around new ventures. Today, our focus is on our strategy for confronting racism and community economic development. In this critical moment of multiple pandemics, COVID, racism, climate, and the economy, we have to ask ourselves whether we will recover and retrench or recreate an economy that works for all. So here with us today is someone who has been in the trenches in this work to share information, experience, and insights to help us think about how policy can move us towards some realistic solutions, some better solutions. Braden Crooks is founding partner of Designing the We, a social impact design studio operating in community-driven social and economic development. The Design the We team designs programs, policies, and enterprises that grow local communities and global networks dealing with deep crisis, from the history of redlining to the future of work. He is on the board of the New York State Sustainable Business Council and has served as the president of the board of Sure We Can, a nonprofit collective for canners, who are those who make their living by redeeming cans and bottles for 5 cents. I used to do that, and I'd be rich by now. Anyway, Braden graduated from the innovative program MS Design in Urban Ecologies at Parsons, the New School for Design, in May 2014 with honors, taught ecological thinking and urban issues at Parsons, and produced a live audience web series about New York. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts based in London. He received his undergraduate education at the Pennsylvania State University for Landscape Architecture. In Pennsylvania, he founded Groundswell Pennsylvania, a community and environmental rights initiative, which campaigned for and passed a community environmental bill of rights in the borough of State College, Pennsylvania, by popular vote in November of 2001. Very good, Braden. This was the first instance where rights of nature were passed in the United States by using a popular vote. Groundswell helped pass a second initiative in Ferguson Township, Pennsylvania in November of 2012. Braden lives and gardens in Brooklyn, New York. Now, after we hear from Braden, who has a stellar resume, we will open the floor to questions. So please enter them in the Q&A box on Zoom. We will be recording this session, so if you have any information that you would like to share with the group, please include it with any links, and we'll make the chat available to you later. So with that, Braden, you're up.
Okay, wow, thank you so much. Really very happy to be here and talk with everyone. And thank you so much for inviting us. This is an incredibly important topic, obviously near and dear to our heart and work, and very happy to share it with folks. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I will go through a sort of presentation, a couple pieces of work that we have. One is an exhibit, which is called Undesigning the Red Line, that looks at the history of redlining. We definitely believe that by looking at this history is the first step in actually saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? And then an example of some of that work. And if folks have questions, please do put them in the chat as we go along. I'll try and answer those, and we'll also try and give as much time as we can to some reflection and conversation at the end. So I'm going to try and jump on this right now. Please bear with me as I share my screen. So hopefully, MaryAnne, if you can give me a thumbs up if you see this. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to kind of do a bit of an overview of this exhibit, which looks at this history. I'm going to talk about the history in the context of today and why it's important to understand for today. And then we'll look at, well, what does it mean to undesign redlining in a local context? And kind of these three frameworks that we use, which is to reframe, redesign, and reinvest. We'll talk about some lessons and some policy implications, especially in the conversation afterward. So, when we first started in 2015, we were working in a lot of different places, having conversations with cities and with organizations and others. And we realized, wait a minute, nobody seems to have a really clear idea as to why we're dealing with the problems that we have, right? We have these immense challenges of inequality, education, health, right? And we're like, okay, we need to solve health problems, right? Well, what if the problems are actually, more of symptoms of much deeper, more entangled histories? And so we said, what if the problem we actually need to solve is redlining, right? And these types of programs and policies that were very deliberately created and designed to really put people on a different playing field. And down here you see on the bottom right a redlining map. This is of Trenton, New Jersey, which is where I'm going to talk a little bit about today, right? And these maps are produced in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. So this goes way back. I mean, obviously we can trace the history much, much further back. But right, redlining, we realized was a crucial piece of this puzzle to answer, why does Trenton look the way it does today? And you go back to these maps that were created as part of the New Deal, we're rolling out middle-class wealth building programs, the social safety net, right? We're creating all these systems which are going to create the American middle class, but it's 1930s. The federal government is explicitly racist, right? We're in the height of Jim Crow. And they're going to want to bake into all those systems and structures ways to cut out people of color from benefiting from them. And redlining is going to be how we do this with home ownership, right? So you see, right, we're standing on a block here in Trenton and we realize, wow, half the houses are abandoned. We have decades and decades of disinvestment, right? Well, this is going to be tied to these maps because the maps are going to say, they're going to be giving out home loans. They're tied to home ownership, right? The 30-year mortgage, the 15-year mortgage, insuring home loans, eventually the GI Bill, right? We're kind of creating the American dream of owning your own home as a core wealth building tool of the middle class. But the federal government wants this to be just really an opportunity for white families. And the maps are a risk assessment system. So this is before you and I would have a credit score. But instead of giving us a credit score, they're going to give our whole neighborhood a credit score. And that's essentially what the redlining maps are. There's only 4 scores, either green, which is great, definitely lend here, blue, which is second best, yellow, which is called declining, and finally red, which are called hazardous areas that really get cut off from these home loans. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, now you're going to see property values decline, right? Because it's harder to sell a home. But also because it's federal, it's going to bleed out into bank branch locations, insurance rates, business loans, right? Basically access to the money system in general. And the crazy thing is that when these neighborhoods are redlined, like this, where we're looking at here in East Trenton, used to be called Coalport, was a thriving neighborhood. It was hardly the blighted, abandoned, right, empty neighborhoods we think of as disinvested neighborhoods today. No, it had full storefronts, jazz clubs. It had everything that you might think of in a thriving neighborhood. But nonetheless, it gets redlined, and this leads to decades of disinvestment and decades of spiraling downwards, right? And the question is, of course, well, why do that to an area? Well, we have the answers in the redlining maps. So here's an area description for area in the Bronx, which is where April grew up, who's the co-founder of Designing the We, right? And you get down to line C, and it says detrimental influences, Negro infiltration. right? So the federal government is going to be totally explicit. There's no mincing of words or hiding. The federal government comes out and says, there are hazardous social and racial groups in America, and we need to know where they are, and we need to know where they're quote unquote infiltrating, or sometimes they use the word invading. And by tracking all of that, right, we're going to zone those areas for disinvestment. And this is a big shift because beforehand, right, if I was a Black family, I might myself have be discriminated against and have trouble getting a loan. But now, so will all my white neighbors because I happen to live on the block. And this is going to spur white flight out of those neighborhoods and begin concentrating people in what we call hypersegregation, concentrating people into redline neighborhoods at the same time that we're disinvesting and devaluing those neighborhoods, right? So while that's happening on the one hand, on the other hand, we're opening up this huge spigot of wealth building, right? For home ownership. It's going to create the American middle class. Well, who gets that, right? Well, that's going to go to these green and blue areas. And if you're familiar with the Bronx here, you see Fieldston and Riverdale there in green. Well, what makes an area green? Well, it's not just going to be say, okay, yes, this is where white folks are living. It's also going to be say, here are areas that have restrictions on hazardous infiltration, meaning this has a covenant that says it's a whites only neighborhood, or it's in the deed of the house. You can't sell this house to a Black family or an Asian family or Hispanic family. And at this point in time, right, the federal government's not particularly targeting Black families, but also new immigrant families, Eastern Europeans, Jewish people, right? Groups of people that will later become considered white, but at this point in time they call foreign born, right? But if, you know, targeting people of color and new immigrants sounds familiar, right? That's what we're doing here in the 30s. And we create these green neighborhoods. Well, a lot of the time, the areas that can say, you know, we're going to be whites only or can wall themselves off, right, are going to be new development, suburban areas, right? Areas that can kind of isolate themselves. Whereas more cities and urban areas are already very heterogeneous. So what this is going to do over time is produce a geography, right? A geographic structure and landscape that we're used to in cities across the country, which is concentrated areas of poverty in cities, mostly people of color, and much wealthier, much wider suburbs that surround them. And that basic geographic structure, right, is something that we still grapple with all over. Now, with that, there's things that are changing, right, and shifts that are happening, and we'll talk about that. But that structure, right, cements so much because fast forward till today, right, and you can have different schools, different policing, right, different hospitals, different housing, right, different opportunity, based that all around zip code, and still have different systems for different people, even though you don't need to mention race, right? And you preserve an apartheid type system in the US. And so this, you know, layers into the physical structure of the US. And then the other big outcome is going to be on wealth. Because, right, as we know, right, the number one mechanism for wealth building in the US since this time has been home ownership, although you could say property ownership in general. And not only are we systematically cutting people out of owning your own home, but those who did, right, are going to lose their money because folks like families like April's, right, who own their own home in the Bronx, number one, don't have access to federally backed home loans. So there's predatory lending and all sorts of contract buys, things like that. And then on the other hand, right, you guess what? You bought in an area that's been slated for decline. So this doesn't become the asset which your family builds wealth that becomes the anchor, right, for you in the future generations to send your kid to college. No, you go underwater, right? You lose your money. So does everyone else. So here comes the blight, abandonment, the fires, right? And so this happened to millions of families. So redlining didn't just maintain racial inequity, it really deepened it and extended it. And they still live with it now. So this is one of the reasons why we think redlining in particular is so important because it helps us answer the question, how do we go from this Jim Crow era racism, right, where you can read on this form in black and white, and then that gets designed into structural racism, where it's literally designed into the physical landscape and structure of the country. And so, right, this leads us into this era of building value and destroying that value, right? So for some, right, they're going to go to Levittown, they're going to buy homes. For others, we have things like urban renewal, the bottom left, right? You see the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway straight through the Bronx, new waves of displacement. This paragraph here, right, is from a real estate textbook talking about this phenomenon. It says, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes, and forego their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. Right? And they refer to that as the property value argument, because if you're a good realtor, protect the property value of your clients, right? And that's how you're going to do it. You know, this is going to lead into this era of quote unquote urban decay, because now the tax base is leaving cities, blue collar manufacturing jobs leave cities, right? You have massive disinvestment. You have policies like planned shrinkage, when cities start cutting their budgets, right? And they cut the budgets oftentimes specifically in neighborhoods that are in decline. So you have street maintenance, trash pickup, schools, libraries, parks, right? Actually, the first thing to get cut in the Bronx was fire departments. It was one of the first, if not the first, smart cities program ever, algorithm to cut fire departments, right? And everywhere that that happens is going to burn. And just imagine the level of disruption, the tearing apart of community fabric, families being moved from place to place, going homeless, right? The trauma that comes with all of this. And then, you know, here comes reactions like broken windows policy, right? Which is to say, well, you know, the answer to this crisis that we've created is the need to crack down, right? And in this moment, we get from the ground up, from the Community Reinvestment Act and community development corporations to the Black Panthers and Young Lords who are doing community organizing and free lunches and clean sweep days, right? A move to say, let's rebuild community, right? Let's invest back into community. But you see, right, from the Nixon administration and the war on drugs into the Reagan and Clinton era, from all political sides, right, a move to say, let's get tough on crime. And by doing that, right, we're going to bring the city back to normal. Well, my question would be, you know, well, why are the windows broken, right? Well, we're not going to say, oh, the windows are broken because of this huge history of structural racism that goes back to redlining, right? No, it's criminals and vandals and drug dealers, and we need to, it's their fault. And by cracking down on them, we'll resolve this. And this just leads us right up into where we are today, where you have huge crisis in policing and mass incarceration. You have the quote unquote cleaning up of neighborhoods. It paves the way for new investment to pour back in. And so now we're in an area where investment's pouring back into many redline neighborhoods around the country for the first time since they were redlining. But as we all know, right, the folks who've been on the front lines of redlining haven't been the beneficiaries of that. And we have an era of serial displacement where housing affordability is a massive crisis. Displacement, homelessness is an increasing crisis. We've had instances of climate displacement across the country, whether that's fires or hurricanes or floods. And where are folks going, right? They're often going to what we think of as new redlined areas, areas further from opportunity, further from investment, et cetera. And so, you know, that gives you just the taste of some of the things we talk about in this exhibit. And I'm trying to move quickly so we can have a lot of time to talk about it. But, you know, some of the lessons that come out of this history is to ask really deliberately, how did we get here? You know, a lot of the crises in one era of this exhibit flow out of the quote unquote solutions of an era prior, policy solutions. You know, this is an example where, you know, here's a small city that was looking to raise revenue and they realized we need to raise property values. So they went around and did code violations in neighborhoods that they thought were blighted because they said, well, people were just lazy. They're not painting their house. They're not cleaning up their yard, right? So the code violations that they started issuing, people couldn't pay. So what do? They put a tax lien on the house, right? And take the house. Well, guess what? You know, these are the red line neighborhoods of that city. So, you know, they've diagnosed the problem as people's behavior, but really it's decades of structural racism, decades of disinvestment and deliberate policy. And instead of looking at that history and realizing, wait, we need to undo that history, they're reproducing it. Why? Because they're not asking themselves, how did we get here? And they're not intentionally undoing this history. And if you're not intentionally undoing it, you're most often reproducing it. And this has to do with the mentalities this whole system and world, right, has delivered to us. Mentalities of hierarchies of human value, of judging people and blaming all sorts of behavior when actually structural issues are to blame, right? um, and that is something, that bias and that deep assumptions and social programming is something that we all have to heal from and undo. And then, another example of this is how our policy does or doesn't undo and build wealth, for example. And this is starting to get into thinking about policy. We often talk about the Community Reinvestment Act as one of the few pieces of policy that touches on reinvesting in neighborhoods. Well, one example of that, down here on the bottom left, right, a very common example from around the country is the Harlem Pathmark on 125th Street. Here's an example of a community that came together in the late 80s and early 90s and said, wow, we're a food desert, food apartheid, right? And this is because of this huge history of disinvestment in our neighborhood. We need a grocery store. So they advocated for that, right? And then the city got together and they partnered with the nonprofit and they gave a whole bunch of subsidies, right, to bring in Pathmark, which is a corporate grocery chain. And everybody celebrated and said, wow, we did it. We got our grocery store, right? But what if we looked at this in a more systemic way? What did we really get? Well, one, yeah, we got some groceries and we got some minimum wage grocery store jobs, right? That will chalk up to job development. But a lot of the investment, millions of dollars that are put into this are going to corporate shareholders, right? Somewhere else. And, fast forward till today, and guess what? They've sold this. And here comes luxury condos uh, to replace this, right? So the public got heavily involved in this project. But where's a lot of this public impact? And I just put it in contrast. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it's just one example of dozens across the country, co-ops and other models. This is the People's Community Market, which was involving crowd investment and stock and shareholdership, right? Where they raised the money locally to build their grocery store and got that matched. And then, right, talk about a community-owned grocery store, right, and community designed one where now, the dollars that are spent there, a large part of them are flowing back out into the community and building wealth there, right? The folks in the neighborhood designed it. So they're creating community kitchen and programs for kids, and it's creating value, right, that a normal grocery store doesn't create for the neighborhood. Right. And they own it. So they want to shop there and they want to keep it there. Right. And it's not something that's going to sell out necessarily. And, the question is, how do we realign these policies? We're so used to the public-private partnership model, right? What about a public-community partnership model? How do we begin investing and seeing those dollars, same dollars, right, but flowing back out into neighborhoods? But one of the things that we're missing, right, is the infrastructure to produce these projects, because something like the Pathmark model, right, we know everybody's getting paid to make that model happen, right? The corporate folks at the Pathmark to the people making the deals. But so much of the models, like the ones that we work on that are community owned, are relying on volunteers knocking doors and pro bono designers like ourselves, and we're patching it together. And there's not enough infrastructure, right? That's sustained on the local basis. And so when you start to put these pieces together, we talk about how our perceptions create our designs, create our built environment, shapes our perceptions, right? So for that first example, the perception that the reason these neighborhoods are dilapidated is because simply people are too lazy to take care of it, creates a design program, right, which is punitive, which leads us into the built environment where we're beginning to take homes and we're reproducing that history, which is going to lead right back into the perception. So where do we intervene in that? Everywhere, in every stage, right? When we look at this as how we meeting human needs, and how those needs are not getting met, which then, right, creates a lack of infrastructure in neighborhoods for things like investment ready projects, et cetera, right? And so that's where we start to say, okay, we need a whole new kind of process around community development. And this is kind of a diagram that we have for our We Lab, right? How do we bring people together? How do we really start to plug in and produce new ecosystems? And, we look at pedagogy, we look at design, we look at activation, right? and this sort of the gears and wheels of making that all work. It's not a siloed approach. It's not something that can happen with one organization or one structure. It's really about ecosystem building. And and so I want to look briefly at how this played out in Trenton, New Jersey. As I mentioned before, right, Trenton is a city that is still very much so living with and dealing with the history of redlining and urban renewal and policies like it. And so we began, right, this process with a reframing, right? Not just looking at, okay, we've got education issues over here and we've got housing issues over here, but actually we have a whole untangled history to deal with, right? And so on the left here, you look at the neighborhood of East Trenton, where we were working and been working. And you see, right, in 1940, you have Coalport and Goosetown, which were thought of as sort of the second downtown of Trenton, a black downtown, a thriving, dense neighborhood, which gets redlined. Well, and then guess what? Here comes urban renewal. And so they literally bulldoze the neighborhood and clear it off, and then dump it in the river, in the Delaware River. It becomes becomes an island in the Delaware River, and the development they were going to build there, they run out of money, never do it. So here comes the car impound lots and all of this, right? And so today East Trenton is a neighborhood that struggles with disinvestment, even as resilient and amazing as the people that there are. Right now, here up in the upper left, you see this is when they were doing the urban renewal, right? It says the slums are going, right? This is the type of language that you'll find, right? A lot of times they will say nationwide, the slums are a cancer on the city, right? So what do you do with a tumor? You remove it, right? So here we go, we're going to remove, right, this thriving neighborhood because it's deemed a slum, and never really do anything to heal that. And so, we began with hosting these conversations. We brought our Undesign the Redline exhibit down to Trenton. We localized that with a community advisory group like we do in all the cities that we bring it to. We did the contextualization of that, of the crises that we see, to say, this conversation that was almost absent, which is how did we get here? And then began fanning out into the neighborhood, not just hosting, one meeting here or there and see, who shows up, but actually walking the neighborhood, talking to people, sitting on front porches, doing the surveying, and that kind of methodological data, but also sort of a popular education process, to begin hearing people's stories and hearing what they had to say, and bringing those stories that are often so marginalized from the process of making solutions and policy to the forefront of how we were going to um, um, work with and collaboratively in East Trenton, right? And so that becomes a collaborative shared process. That becomes something that people have multiple ways to plug into, and something that we think about as something that should be an ongoing civic infrastructure in our neighborhoods, where we collaborate and we come together to say, what are the needs? What are the opportunities? What's happening right now that wasn't happening a year ago? So often we see these types of processes happen as one-offs, just for one project here or there, or one city move over there. We spoke to many people in Trenton who said, oh, did you come around a couple months ago? We realized, oh, that was some other community engagement thing that happened, and who knows where that data went, and who knows where, where those engagements and stories that they collected are. So how does that become a more of a connected infrastructure and more of an ecosystem is a big question for sustaining this work, especially when that starts to pay dividends, um, and efficiencies in engagement. And that leads us to redesigning, right? Because once we start to reframe the problem, we start to bring everyone together into the process of design and hear the voices that we don't normally hear. we can begin, we began ideating, right? And building off of what was already there in an iterative design process, human-centered design process, that, we realized just a ton of resources and energy and, um, opportunity that exists in any neighborhood that just has to be brought to the surface. Design, it's incredibly important, right? It's a reason why we have the Undesign the Redline exhibit to understand this history. And design is fundamentally, forward-looking and optimistic. And then, this became not just a one-time workshop, right? And we work with the amazing conservatory mansion to host what we call a We Lab pop-up, where you can go and engage with stuff at any time and see the exhibit as well, right? And we start bringing in experts, and we think of this also as popular education. It's not just asking people, okay, what do you want? Well, I, for one, right, speaking for myself, I'm really excited about multi-stakeholder cooperatives, right? That is something that really intrigues me. Well, I wasn't intrigued by it before I knew what it was. So how do we begin not just thinking like, oh, asking folks, do you want the park bench or do you want the, a baseball field? But actually, what are other people doing? What are the examples? How do we learn from each other? How do we engage in a process of knowledge creation together as a community that values that voices? Right, and that led to one of our main engagements, with which this was starting around as the catalyst, which is the Capital City Urban Farm, which is becoming a cooperative, which is just an amazing example of a switch, right, from a disinvestment moment to really investing into the people of East Trenton. This was originally going to be slated as a junkyard. People intervened, right, said we can't do that to this neighborhood. And it's becoming an amazing, thriving space bootstrapping project that is, doing just amazing work for the resources that it has. It's right next to, a little hard to see, maybe in the next image, this building that is next to the urban farm, which is this kind of elbow-shaped lot, is the soup kitchen of Trenton, and they're buying a ton of produce now from the farm, and feeding folks and doing cooking lessons, and we have a kitchen, and starting to leverage those resources and things like that, right? These are dollars that were being spent on food either way. Now they're flowing back into the neighborhood and projects, right? And so working with multi-stakeholder partners and aligning resources and things like that is super important, but it's not something that there usually are resources for, that kind of ecosystem building. We often say in our neighborhoods, we're trying to build a foundation with bricks but no mortar, right? We have organizations and institutions and these types of actors, but we don't often have these kinds of brokers who are working in the community to try and build the relationships and sustain them. And so because of that, everyone's like, oh, we never have any capacity to collaborate. We never have any capacity to build relationships, right? And this is leading to the reinvestment in this neighborhood, because this is a neighborhood that's near the Trenton Transit Station. This is a neighborhood where we could see a lot of real estate speculation. But it's one where we want to see how does investment come back into a neighborhood that's been redlined, that really truly lifts all boats, right? And doesn't wash people away. How does that become a model that's neighborhood wide? And we're looking at community land trusts and we created the Garden State Agri-Code Project, which is a community land trust, to create ownership, right? And we have our vision, right, for the cooperative farm, right, which is just incredibly, has all the pieces and robust, and people have been adding to and continues to grow, that needs that reinvestment, right? And then how does that begin to catalyze a whole ecosystem of projects, right? This is, people come together around a project and they're like, well, what about a makerspace? And what about, um, a housing ownership, right? How do we, build home ownership in the neighborhood with a community land trust? All these questions that one project is never going to be able to answer. So, how does this really strategic ground up process, um, becomes something that anyone can plug into. Folks can come and show up and say, how do we plug in? Where do we plug in? Where's my value that I add to this ecosystem, and be ready for that. Most of the time, almost everyone who lives in whether it's your own neighborhood or even if you're going to a new one, right? Where do you show up, right? Where do you plug in? Um, often not something that we know how to do. And so that becomes, right, this ongoing ecosystem. And I want to end just kind of talking about the players in that and what that vision is, because we start with this history and we can show, right, all the things that we need to do. Um, and each of us, right, are going to be, one dot in this diagram, right? So we often say ecosystem building is the opposite of redlining, right? So if redlining is about dividing folks up and valuing some and devaluing others, building these ecosystems is about creating the connections that produce shared value. And that type of work has not been has historically not been the approach. So trying to build that into these types of projects is a big systems transformation project that we're all engaged in. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm okay. We got about 15 minutes for discussion, and any questions you may have. And of course, there's just a ton to say about policy and all the other pieces.
Well, thank you, Braden. That's just amazing. And I can't applaud you enough for the value of this work that you guys are doing and the impact that it can have on communities. And but we got a really good question from Cynthia, who's on this call. She asks, so how do you maintain contact and communication with neighbors during this time of COVID-19? How do you do this?
Absolutely. Well, obviously, there's pieces of it that are a huge struggle right now. We're engaged in a lot of projects that have extended their timelines because they want to make sure they robustly reach everybody, and that's more important than getting it done quickly. And I think that that's really laudable. We also have virtual tools and engagements that we can have. Not all of those are accessible to everyone. And we have done outdoor exhibits and things like that as well. And obviously, when you're really embedded community organizer, right, you might have people's phone numbers and you can call them up and begin checking on folks and that kind of thing. And so it really takes a lot of these tools. One thing I'll say is we're really invested and interested in creating more web apps and virtual tools that can facilitate that as a support infrastructure, right? One of the things that we talk about is really seeing these processes as an infrastructure to be invested in as an ongoing piece rather than a one-off that we do for any given project or planning process or what have you, so that that's always there. And that is virtual infrastructure, physical infrastructure and spaces, and then the people, right? And that's one of, we have, for example, we're thinking a fellows project with people that are really embedded, who are the ones who are going to have the phone numbers and things like that and know the names of folks.
So that's really interesting. And one of the thoughts that I had while you were talking about COVID-19, the impact of COVID and what that has made transparent to us in terms of problems, is that another thing about these communities is the closeness. Everything is really compact and people live in environments where, in a situation like this, where you have a pandemic, where you need social distancing and you need space, that's not something that is even doable and given the living circumstances. And what does that mean, going forward, that the fact that we need to think about space, spatial environments, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, oh boy, a lot of this process kind of thing often happens, in church basements, and it happens in, living rooms and things like that. And what you find is there isn't a lot of, physical space infrastructure for our civic life. just in general, right? And so that's definitely something to consider going forward. And nice open area spaces that we have ventilation, things like that. Um, and and so we're talking about had a project, for example, called Libraries as a Community Anchor, which was really reinventing and rethinking about libraries. Yes, obviously we love books, and we're going to have a lot of them there, as well as all the other resources that a community could need, and kind of a town hall and engagement, and as a spot to plug in. There are already existing infrastructure that we have a lot to invest in.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question from the chat from Vicky Parker. Hi, Vicky. Thanks for being with us today. She asks, how do opportunity zones fit into this redesigned ecosystem?
It's a great question. It sort of remains to be seen, I think, with this policy. A lot of folks have pointed out, and probably everyone on this call knows, right, that the policy in general is meant to benefit investors, and that's a lot of the thinking, right? And our question always, and it's similar with, we're at 40 years of the Community Reinvestment Act, right, which has done a lot. It has done a lot. But one of the questions we always asked about these types of programs is, where does the investment end up? Whose pockets does the money in? Follow the money, right? And similar to that example I gave about the Pathmark versus the community design project, is that we can invest in projects like the community-owned project, or we can invest in projects like the Pathmark and find that we're, on the one hand, building wealth for people locally, and we're building ownership and reinvesting in people, or this is just a mechanism for more wealth extraction, which actually, if you look at the Pathmark, right, which had exorbitant prices for the groceries and so forth, is basically just extracting wealth. So many of the people involved in designing that policy were wealth extracting mindset people, rather than regenerative, sustainable investment in places that touches everybody. So that's going to be the big question, I think. How do we make sure that those dollars flow in that other way? And part of it is, before even getting to there, where's the infrastructure that's going to produce the projects to be invested in at all?
And when you were talking about the history of the Pathmark coming into the community, and then it being replaced by a community food market or something, it brought to mind a bit of history that's really important to remember when it comes to policy. So as a result, the riots in the 60s, specifically the Watts riots, when the then president, I think was it Johnson? Anyway, the president at that time was looking for a solution for, okay, there's all this civic unrest, and so how do we remedy this? And with a mind toward investing. So what was also happening at that time was McDonald's was, had just launched and was real successful in the suburbs. And so it was somebody's brilliant idea that, I know, we'll invest in minority-owned enterprises and give people all this money so they can go open up all their franchisee-owned McDonald's all throughout the neighborhood, which led to, this just deluge of all these fast food restaurants that I now call, in these urban neighborhoods, I refer to them as fast food belts. And these fast food belts that created economic development because you had minority ownership, but simultaneously help forward a health epidemic because of the contribution to diabetes and heart disease and all these things that these fast food does to you. So there was this, on the one hand, this intent around, okay, the investment in this community, but nobody thinking about what the impact that might be, and the fact that the fast food industry began to become the competing with produce, in terms of accessibility, affordability, all that kind of stuff, in the lifestyles that people were living in this neighborhood, which is a problem that we're facing today. So we're still trying to kind of get past that hurdle of educating people on food and nutrition and health and wellness, cutting back on those foods, at the same time realizing the impact that that's going to have on minority entrepreneurs who own those franchises in some of those communities, understanding that, there's this tension where
Yep.
the community does really have to sort of be a part of that conversation about, how do we solve this, and how do we, create more affordable, healthy foods for our communities, and do it in a way that, where the neighborhood grows, as opposed to, taking something away from minority entrepreneurs. I know that's a whole conversation on its own, but it's just something that I've been, when we talk about food justice, there's so much interplay, there's so much crossover in that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. And there hasn't been a history of a holistic kind of approach to say, how does this project hit health and economic development and, reach everybody, right? So, and there's so much to say about that. And and that's a process of education and popular education, bringing people together and bringing people into that conversation. Um, that hasn't been a conversation in our whole society. So don't expect to find it everywhere. And
Right.
so, and that's one of the amazing things about the farm was that it's been, people are like, wait a minute, we have recipes, we have people doing a whole herbal garden around herbal medicine, and they'll have all this knowledge, right? And so, there's just an example of something that's ready, for these types of programs and investments. Um, and what you were saying, I see this question about governments, which I want to just touch on. This is a really great question because oftentimes when we think about the design of these structures as more cooperative and more collective, right? A lot of people have this assumption, oh, that means kumbaya, right? And like everyone gets along. And it's like, actually, when people feel more on an equal playing field, they're more ready to say when they're not happy about something than when they're going to get fired if they do it. So, sometimes it can be spaces of heightened conflict, and that's kind of important, actually. And so, putting conflict resolution and mediation and healing at the center of this conversation is really important. Because actually, that's healthy because it's going to show you where the snags are, and it's going to lead you to the places where you need to do healing work, where you need to address trauma, where you need to do mediation. And so, we think about that, and that extends, from projects like this to things like community justice centers, which I think is just a movement that I really, really appreciate, and as shifting away from our policing and punitive to community justice and healing. And so, again, thinking holistically, I'm like, these folks over here are doing some amazing work on that. How do we connect this movement around into there? So, and the last thing I'd say about that is, communities. Um, there is no one community interest. They're not, blank, same groups, right? Everybody's different. People come with different interests, and that has to be part of the conversation when you talk about neighborhoods and communities, for sure. A lot of folks, we push back on in neighborhoods who said, we run this organization, we represent the community. I'm like, well, there's actually a lot of difference here, and that needs to get represented as well.
Mm. Okay, well, Tim, thank you for that excellent question that led us to Braden giving us an excellent answer. So with regard to policy work, if we can end on that note, and then of course, Thomas, I know this is your specialty area as well, so feel free to contribute. Is there anything that we should be aware of, or that we can, be paying attention to, that would be important to help advance the work that you're doing on the front lines of this work in economic development?
Sure. Yeah. Mentioned before when we were talking earlier, things like HR 40, right? Looking at reparations and repairing this history. I think it needs to happen. And it's not just a check in the mail. It's really about systems change and ownership and community wealth building. And we need to break that conversation open. We're looking at that with some partners on the municipal level in Baltimore, a policy approach towards municipal, and thinking about that on the national scale, and also integrating a reparative approach. So, for example, we're working with folks who are putting together proposals for the next mayor of New York, and like, what is a reparative approach to housing? Right, that actually looks at this history and starts to think about that. So those are maybe just changing existing policy a bit, or it's totally new. We're definitely looking at things like community land trusts and home ownership and things like that. So that's there. I mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act. I think that's a big opportunity to think about how it starts to support models like this more, and how we leverage, neighborhood-based resources to do more of this work. I mentioned libraries and things like that. That's existing infrastructure that is chronically underfunded to begin with, but we can start to reimagine. And there's almost a nonstop, from the national to the local. I mean, you look at what national policy has often prioritized, and it's that McDonald's type approach, right, that you mentioned. So we need to kind of spend a lot of time to change that, and reform those policies.
Okay. I'm putting that into the chat. So to remind people that Community Reinvestment Act and HR 40 are two current existing policies that we should be focused on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And you also look at, for example, with the sometimes called Green New Deal or whatever suite of policy, we're not going to call it that again, but how does the Green New Deal undesign redlining is a great question, right? You look at the renovations for efficiency, for example, in a neighborhood like Trenton, where a lot of the houses are old, a lot of the houses have lead, a lot of the houses are horrible energy efficiency, and there's a tremendous opportunity to see the investment that they will take to bring those into much healthier homes, and sustain more energy efficient. Where does that dollar flow? When you look at things like solar, how do we do community-owned solar projects in New York State? There's a lot of folks on the state level. I work with New York State Sustainable Business Council, and we've had some recent legislation passed, which is trying to move more in that direction, and prioritizing models of community solar and things like that. As we make this transition in energy, how do we also transition ownership? And maybe it's a blended model, right? Of where we integrate, a project we've looked at is community wealth funds, where community members have shares, but then that's, can be at 20% of one project and something like that. It's not full community ownership, but it's participation in the ownership. And so there's a number of tools that I think are almost ready to go. They just need to get this kind of support.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, we're at the end of our hour. There's really so much more. I know I have a million thoughts and questions, and we could go on all day.
I want to put, before people jump off, where you can find more about our exhibit on the chat. I'll put a link before I forget, because I had said I would do that. And on there you can see a VR version of our New Orleans exhibit, and there's also a link to a great marketplace segment that they did about it. It's quick and shareable. And you can obviously reach out to me with any other questions as well. I'll put my email.
Okay, so when you put that in your chat, you put it in the private response accidentally. But I also want, so if you'll, fix that, make that adjustment, that'd be great. Everybody can see that. But we'll be sharing the chat so people also see it. The other thing is, I also just want to make sure that everyone on this call is aware of a document that the American Sustainable Business has started working on maybe a year ago, on an economic system that works for all. And that it's like 100-page, it's work of about 50 people across the country, focused on ideas for solutions to create an economic system that works for all. And that document is at our website and is downloadable. So we welcome you, please take an opportunity to review it in your weekend leisurely reading, and then get back to us with any thoughts you have or suggestions. It's a living document, and it's one that we want to hand off to the next administration with some real solid solutions and some support from people across the country who believe in it. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that. And with that said, I want to wish everybody a great weekend. Thomas, do you have anything you'd like to say to?
I'm good. I think we covered it all. That was a great session. I learned a lot.
Great session.
I'm looking forward to hearing feedback.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, listen, everybody have a wonderful evening, great weekend, and don't forget to vote.
Vote.
Vote. I know we're talking to preach to the choir.
Still, doesn't hurt.
Right. Well,
Wash your hands, wear a mask, social distance, and vote.
Right. And take somebody with you. Okay.
Take several people.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.